Over the last year, we've covered just about everything relating to the Haunted Mansion, from the original attraction at Disneyland, the clone of it that opened up at the Magic Kingdom, to even the movie based on it. But one thing we've neglected talking about altogether is perhaps the most infamous version of the ride, that being the one hosted at Disneyland Paris, the Phantom Manor. Amongst some Disney, and especially Haunted Mansion fans, the Manor is considered to be the best version of the attraction anywhere, mostly due to its entirely different backstory and numerous thematic changes. But to really get an idea of why it's so highly praised and what sets it apart from the other versions, we'll need to take a look back at its development. Following the success of the second Haunted Mansion in Florida, the ride became known as a staple of the Disney parks. A trend that was only furthered in 1983 when they opened yet another version of the mansion at Tokyo Disneyland, this one closely resembling its Magic Kingdom counterpart with very few actual changes, but that's a story for another day. By the time Disney was planning to create a new international park during the late 80s, this time in Paris, it wasn't much of a surprise that the Haunted Mansion would be included in its roster of attractions. However, bringing the mansion to a new country would also present quite a few new challenges. The first of which being the new park wasn't going to have a New Orleans or a Liberty Square section in it, leaving the ride without any place to go. So, the solution they had was to relocate the attraction to the park's Frontierland, where they had plenty of available space. From there, the Imagineers, namely Jeff Burke, who was in charge of that land, began to redesign the mansion's facade so it had better fit with the new area. But as the rest of the land around the attraction was designed and the story for it created, the idea for the mansion itself took on a new form. Now, instead of using the traditional story, or lack thereof, from all the previous versions, the new one would now connect with the land itself, and the same story that all of its attractions were a part of. After a few years of various tweaks and revisions, the final story for Disneyland Paris' Frontierland went something like this. In the late 1800s, there was an Old West prospector by the name of Henry Ravenswood. Henry ended up hitting gold at Big Thunder Mountain in the year 1849. Shortly after that, he started up his own mining company and began hiring on more people as he looked for gold throughout the rest of the mountain, in the process creating the town of Thunder Mesa. As the town blossomed and Henry grew more wealthy, he also set up his own residence there by building himself a large manor overlooking the entire area. As the mountain's gold became more scarce, Henry and his men began to dig deeper into the earth, causing the natives to warn that if they continued, they'd disturb the spirit of the Thunderbird, a legendary creature that, if awoken, would bring great misfortune to the town and all those in it. Ignoring the warning, Henry and his men continued mining. By the time the town was in full swing during the late 1850s, Henry's daughter Melanie had fallen in love with a train conductor named Jake. The two later set out to marry, but once Henry found out they planned to leave Thunder Mesa afterwards, he vowed to stop it. However, Henry and his wife were both killed in a massive earthquake only a few days later that would also destroy a large part of the town and kill most of its residents. Her desire to leave only intensified by her parents' death, Melanie quickly arranged her wedding, only to be left waiting by her groom, who never showed up. It's then revealed throughout the ride that a mysterious phantom killed Jake on the day of their wedding, leaving Melanie to haunt the house forever. And many assume that the Phantom is actually the spirit of Henry Ravenswood, come back from the dead to ensure Melanie never actually leaves Thunder Mesa. With that new story in mind, Imagineers began to retool the original attraction, this time using the Disneyland version as its basis, switching and changing around certain scenes to tell their new story. However, this is where they ran into their second problem. Unlike the other versions of the attraction in America, or even Japan, this version couldn't rely on narration to tell its story, on account of the fact that there were quite a few different spoken languages throughout Europe. This is also why the original name was now changed to be the Phantom Manor, since that could be better translated while getting across the same message. The show designers also now focused on visual storytelling, using characters and music to convey the messages and emotions they were going for. And this also resulted in a new musical score composed by John Debney. Taking inspiration from the ride's original soundtrack, the new orchestral pieces managed to capture a certain melancholic and depressing tone that really nailed the new tragic feeling of the attraction. By the end of 1990, development on the attraction's backstory as well as its scene layout were just about finished. After that, they began construction and eventually opened the ride with the rest of the park on April 12th of 1992. Now, on account of the fact that this is a foreign ride, I assume most of us aren't all that familiar with it, or at least not as intimately as we might be with its American counterparts. So for this video, we'll be doing something a bit different. Instead of kinda glossing over the ride itself like we normally do, we'll now be going through this attraction scene by scene, and hopefully squeezing a bit more history out of a few of the ride's effects and scenes. But before we head inside, let's take a closer look at its facade. Aside from the obvious architectural differences between the manor and mansions, you'll notice that this was the first version of the attraction to feature a completely run-down and decrepit exterior. If you remember from the first Haunted Mansion video, Walt was very much opposed to the idea of an abandoned-looking building in Disneyland, which is why both the California and Florida versions turned out as pristine as they did. But when it came to the one in Paris, Jeff Burke felt that if the manor was presented in its pristine state, it would not only undermine the attraction's backstory, but also actively confuse parkgoers who might not expect a Haunted Mansion-type ride in that facade. So, with that, the manor became as withered and dilapidated as it is today. As for the actual style of the building, Imagineers pulled from many different sources to get the final product. Everything from a few of the original pieces of concept art for Disneyland's Haunted Mansion, to the Fourth Ward School in Nevada, to even the Bates House from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. On top of that, the manor also had a much larger outdoor area and queue than any of the previous versions, in which you pass by a gazebo and through an overgrown lawn as you go up to the front of the house. Once there, it very much begins to resemble the Disneyland version of the mansion, with an almost identical looking foyer. Really, the biggest change is with its design. Now, instead of a more New Orleans influence on things like the lights and wallpaper, it now has a much more Western feel to it. Additionally, the foyer also has a new mirror that slowly begins to show a young woman in it as the pre-show begins. Along with that, you'll also hear the attraction's familiar opening lines, but instead of coming from the original ghost host of Paul Frees, we now hear the Phantom himself, voiced by Vincent Price.
Let's just take it.
Okay, we're just gonna take it. Stand by.
93.
Where hinges creak in doorless chambers, where strange and frightening sounds echo through the halls,
where candlelights flicker though the air is deathly still. This is Phantom Manor.
Initially chosen for his more theatrical cadence and menacing laugh, Vincent was tasked with reciting both the French and English versions of the narration. However, due to his difficulty with the French script, they ended up using another actor for that part of the narration, before eventually removing the English part as well, essentially cutting Price altogether from the ride. Today, the only place where you can still hear him is in the Phantom's laugh that plays during a few different scenes. Moving on into the stretching room, it both looks and acts pretty much the same as the one at Disneyland, even down to doubling as an elevator that moves guests to where the ride's loading area is. Also, the 4 stretching portraits have all been switched out as well, each now featuring the bride Melanie in a few different situations that all turn a bit more nefarious as the room stretches. This, of course, is topped off with the infamous "There's always my way" line before the lights go out, but instead of seeing the ghost host hanging above us, it's now somebody else, and if we look closely, we can actually see another figure holding the rope. In terms of the storyline, this poor fella is actually Jake, Melanie's groom, who was lured up to the attic and hanged by the Phantom so she'd never be able to marry him. A very interesting twist to the original scene that really sets the tone for the rest of the ride. From there, you're ushered down a hallway with 2 sets of changing portraits on both sides, not unlike the ones at Disneyland and the Magic Kingdom. However, at the end of this hallway, there's a large painting of the bride-to-be instead of the 2 follow-you busts from the original, even though that same effect can be seen once you turn the corner into the load area. Speaking of which, the Manor's loading area has a completely different backdrop than either of its predecessors, now featuring a grand staircase with an impending storm visible outside its windows. After boarding, the first scene you come across is the endless hallway. Like before, it features the floating candelabra and moving suit of armor, but it also introduces Melanie in both animatronic form as she beckons us further into the mansion, as well as in Pepper's ghost form, where she begins to disappear and reappear down the hallway. Heading into the next scene, we see a piano with its keys moving all by themselves. This effect, undoubtedly lifted from the Magic Kingdom version, replaced what would have been the conservatorium at Disneyland. On top of that, we can also see the Phantom's shadow on the floor as he plays, an effect that used to be entirely unique to the Manor until it was replicated at the Magic Kingdom in 2007. From there, we drift backwards through the corridor of doors, past the 13th hour clock and into the seance room. Now, this scene doesn't exactly make much sense given the new storyline, but I guess continuity isn't all that important, so we're just gonna roll with it. Anyhow, Leota's seance has been updated with some entirely new lines of dialogue referencing the bride. In addition, all of the floating instruments have been removed as well, and the table her ball is sitting on has this kind of swirling motion to it that you don't see anywhere else. After that, we head into the ballroom where there's a big party taking place, with many of the same ghosts from the original here as well. In the back, standing on the staircase, we can see the bride still waiting for her groom, while behind her in the window, the Phantom can also be seen laughing at her. The story in this scene goes that after killing Jake, the Phantom invited over loads of spirits to the manor for an endless party, mocking the celebration Melanie and Jake would have had if they were able to get married. We then head into the boudoir, or this ride's version of the attic, where we see Melanie once again, this time much older and finally realizing that she'll never actually see Jake again, while sitting at a mirror that very much resembles a human skull. A nice little reference to the 1892 painting All Is Vanity by Charles Allen Gilbert. From there, we leave the manor itself and finally see the Phantom up close and personal, once again laughing maniacally next to an open grave, no doubt freshly dug for the bride herself. Not too far away from him, we also see some kind of undead ghost dog, a very clear nod to the caretaker and his dog that appear here in the Disneyland attraction. Drifting further back, we soon go underground and see quite a few skeletons bursting out of their coffins and moving around throughout the cavern we're in. This is also where we see the singing busts, one of the few effects from the original that managed to find their way into the manor without any real thematic changes, they're just kinda there. However, they still did get altered by not having one of the heads broken off and missing another bust entirely. Finally, we make our way to the Phantom Canyon. Story-wise, this is the part of Thunder Mesa that was destroyed during the earthquake of 1860 that also killed Henry Ravenswood, and all the spirits we see here are people who were killed along with him. As we head through the town and reach the end of it, we see the Phantom once again, this time in a rotting corpse-like state instead of his previous skeleton form. Lastly, we get a quick glimpse at the remains of Melanie, finally passed over to the other side after a lifetime of waiting. She then directs us out of the canyon and past some mirrors, where we see the Phantom one last time above our ride vehicles. After that, we then disembark, exiting the attraction through the manor's wine cellar and back out to the rest of Thunder Mesa. As far as an attraction goes, the Phantom Manor really did a good job of presenting its story in a fluid and convincing way, which in my opinion is a real step up from the earlier versions, which really just kind of feel like a hodgepodge of various ideas. Additionally, it's pretty interesting to see certain elements of the original mansions expanded upon and used to tell a new story that's extremely different from the one they initially conveyed. And I especially love the attraction's tie-in with the land around it, really giving the manor a full and comprehensive storyline that you can pick up on while you're on the ride or just exploring the surrounding area. As for the attraction's future, it's currently down for a seasonal refurbishment, and has been since January of 2018, but it is said to be coming back in 2019, with some updated and new effects, as well as the return of the original Vincent Price narration from 1992.
Oh, jeez.
Well folks, it looks like we're finally finished with the Haunted Mansion. Between these 4 different videos, we've covered just about everything, with the exception of the Tokyo Disneyland version, which, like I said, is pretty much the same as the one at the Magic Kingdom, just without any of the post-2007 updates. And, I gotta say, I'm a little bit saddened, knowing that this video is the last time I'm ever going to be able to say the phrase Corridor of Doors. I mean, that was the highlight of all these videos. Anyhow, I hope you all enjoyed this year's terrifying Spooktober, and I very much look forward to what we have planned for next year's. I'll be seeing you then.
Now, after the reception, did everyone get heartburn?